You know what wakes me up every Monday morning? Headlines that make you question everything you thought you knew about legacy media. And today, friends, we're starting the week with a bombshell that's been plastered across every major British newspaper. The BBC, that grand institution of British broadcasting, just lost two of its biggest bosses in what's being called the most significant crisis they've faced in a decade. Tim Davie, the Director General himself, and Deborah Turness, the head of BBC News, both gone, resigned. And the reason? A documentary scandal involving Donald Trump that has the White House openly celebrating and the entire British media landscape in absolute chaos. I spent years inside one of those big, well-known media organizations. I watched editors twist stories, reshape narratives, and serve agendas instead of truth. That's why I walked away. Now I work for myself, answer to nobody, and I bring you the stories that matter, the way they actually happened. And if you're tired of the filtered, sanitized version of the news, then do me a favor right now. Hit that like button, smash subscribe, and if this kind of independent journalism matters to you, if you want to see more of this work continue without corporate overlords telling me what I can and cannot say, consider becoming a channel sponsor. It's people like you who make this possible, and I mean that. So let's dive into what exactly brought down two of the most powerful figures in British media. The Daily Mail didn't pull any punches with their headline, BBC bosses quit in disgrace. And disgrace is the right word here, because what we're looking at is a documentary, a panorama investigation no less, that allegedly edited Donald Trump's speech in a way that made it appear he was directly calling for the Capitol to be stormed. Now, whether you love Trump or can't stand him, that's not the point here. The point is editorial manipulation on a scale that even the BBC couldn't defend. Tim Davie himself admitted it in his resignation statement. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that mistakes were made, and as Director General, the ultimate responsibility falls on him. That's a pretty damning admission from someone at the top of one of the world's most respected broadcasting institutions. But here's where it gets interesting. The Daily Telegraph is calling this the biggest BBC crisis in 10 years, framing it as a scandal about bias, institutional bias. Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch weighed in, saying it was right that BBC leadership finally took responsibility. Finally. That word alone tells you how long this has been simmering. But in her farewell speech, Deborah Turness pushed back hard. She said yes, mistakes were made, but she wanted to make it absolutely clear that accusations of institutional bias at BBC News are, quote, not true. Think about that for a second. You're resigning over a scandal that involves allegations of exactly that, institutional bias, and your parting words are to deny it exists. Does that sound like someone taking full responsibility, or does that sound like damage control? The Guardian is reporting that inside the BBC, there's a genuine sense of upheaval. Sources are describing it as feeling like a coup is about to happen. The mood is one of despair, uncertainty. They're now facing the task of finding new leadership for two of the most critical positions in British media. And let me tell you something. Whoever steps into those roles is walking into a minefield. Now, are you still with me? Because this is where things get even more fascinating. Stick around because we're about to talk about how the White House responded to all of this. And trust me, they didn't hold back. The newspaper I reported that BBC bosses resigned over what they're calling a failed Trump film. And here's the kicker. The White House, with what the paper describes as obvious glee, noted that Trump managed to push out the BBC's Director General. That's not just a win for Trump, that's a statement. The Sun went with BBC bosses quit in shame, and they featured Trump's reaction from his Truth Social platform. He wrote, and I'm reading this directly, that the top brass at BBC, including Tim Davie, are all leaving because they got caught doctoring his, quote, very good, even perfect speech from January 6th. Perfect speech. That's Trump's language right there, and whether you think January 6th was an insurrection or a protest gone wrong, the fact remains that a major broadcasting network allegedly manipulated footage in a way that misrepresented what was actually said, and that's the core issue here. The Times described this as death by 1,000 cuts. They're citing insiders who say Davie's resignation wasn't just about this Trump documentary. It was the accumulation of endless smaller crises, constant complaints about how the BBC covered Gaza, accusations around trans issues, the list goes on. It's like the documentary was the final straw that broke an already crumbling structure. The Financial Times called it an uproar over the Trump film, noting that Davie and Turness's departures coincided with the BBC having to formally apologize to lawmakers over the Panorama documentary. The Express was blunt. Boss quits after BBC doctored Trump speech. Doctored. That's the word. And Trump himself didn't hesitate to call the outgoing leadership very dishonest people. Strong words, but given what allegedly happened, can you really blame him for saying it? And listen, I'm not here to defend or attack Trump. I'm here to ask the uncomfortable questions. If a major broadcaster edits a sitting or former president's speech to make it appear more inflammatory than it actually was, what does that say about media integrity? Take a second and drop a comment below. Do you think the BBC was right to resign over this, or should there have been deeper accountability? Let me know what you think, and don't forget to hit that like button if you're finding this valuable. Now, the coverage wasn't entirely dominated by the BBC scandal. The Metro and the Daily Mirror also featured King Charles and the Princess of Wales at a remembrance ceremony. There was a photograph of Princess Catherine wiping away a tear during the solemn event honouring those who fell in 2 world wars and other conflicts. It's a poignant image, and it shared front-page space with the BBC drama. The Metro called it Tears of the Crown, a headline that almost feels Shakespearean, but with that distinctly modern British sentimentality. The Daily Mirror returned focus to the BBC crisis. With Davies' resignation letter front and centre, I must take full responsibility. But they also ran an exclusive about television presenter Caroline Flack, who tragically took her own life in 2020 during ongoing legal proceedings. The former head of the Crown Prosecution Service has now said that Flack should never have been charged in the first place. That's a devastating admission, years too late. The Independent took a completely different angle with a somber black cover, highlighting their partnership with the charity Missing People to launch a service called SafeCall. They're positioning it as a lifeline for families dealing with the nightmare of missing children. Important work, no question. And then, because British media wouldn't be complete without a bit of levity, the Daily Star featured James Macklin, reportedly the tallest member of the Conservative Party at 7 feet 2 inches. He's dreaming of becoming Prime Minister. The headline jokes about what heights British politics can reach, literally. It's a fun visual, him standing in front of a Canary Wharf skyscraper, and honestly, after all the heavy news, it's almost a relief. But let's bring this back to the main event. The BBC resignations. What we're witnessing here is more than just 2 executives stepping down. This is a reckoning. Whether you see it as justice or a political scalp depends on where you sit, but the facts are unavoidable. A documentary was produced. It allegedly misrepresented a controversial political figure's words, and the fallout was so severe that the top leadership had no choice but to resign. Here's what I keep thinking about. If this can happen at the BBC, an organization with centuries of credibility, layers of editorial oversight, and a public service mandate, what's happening at other outlets? How many stories are being shaped, not reported? How many speeches, interviews, and events are being framed in ways that serve a narrative rather than the truth? And before you think I'm just targeting the BBC, I'm not. This is about the industry. The entire structure of legacy media is built on trust. And every time something like this happens, that trust erodes a little more. Trump, love him or hate him, and I'm not here to do either, seized on this moment. He's been calling out media bias for years, and now he's got a resignation from one of the world's most prominent broadcasters to point to as evidence. His supporters will see this as vindication. His critics will argue it's overblown. But the middle, the people who just want accurate information, they're left wondering who they can trust. And that's the real crisis here, not just at the BBC, but across the entire media landscape. Let me bring this all together for you. Today we covered the resignation of 2 top BBC executives, Tim Davie and Deborah Turness, following a scandal over a documentary that allegedly edited Donald Trump's January 6th speech to misrepresent his words. We looked at how British newspapers framed the story, from the Daily Mail's quit in disgrace to the Times' death by 1,000 cuts. We heard Trump's own reaction, calling the outgoing leaders dishonest, and the White House openly celebrating. We also touched on the broader implications, the internal crisis at the BBC, and what this means for media trust going forward. This isn't just about one documentary. It's about accountability, editorial standards, and whether legacy media can survive in an era where every mistake is amplified and every bias is scrutinized. So here's what I need from you. If this kind of deep dive into the stories that actually matter is something you value, then show it. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and seriously consider becoming a channel sponsor. This channel runs because of viewers like you. people who care about getting the full story, not just the sanitized version. Every bit of support helps me keep doing this work without answering to corporate interests or editorial boards. Let's keep this going together.